Now, it's my pleasure to welcome you this evening and to introduce Associate Professor Mary Lou Rasmussen. And I need to say a couple of things about Mary Lou that perhaps are not the types of things that you do at the start of a Dean's lecture. I've got to tell you that of the people that I work with in this faculty, Mary Lou is one of those that just stands head and shoulders above the normal work that we do because of a number of things. Her integrity is unbelievable. Her concern for other people is outstanding. Her approach to teaching is absolutely first class. She pursues an understanding of teaching and learning in her work in ways that just stands her above others. She's simply sensational. And then you get to her research. And if you've had a chance to scroll through any of the things on Mary Lou's homepage, you'll see that not only does she write books, she writes multiple books within a year. And then she does special issues of journals. And then she invites other people to work with her, all of whom, of course, are very pleased to have the opportunity to work with Mary Lou Rasmussen. And what she does is attract the most important people in the field to her ideas, to her work, to do what academics should do. Put out in the world the ideas and the opportunities for others to consider, to critique, and to work with in ways that produce new knowledge. What Mary Lou is going to do tonight, I'm sure, will push the boundaries of that even further. From a personal perspective, I love working with this lady. And I think what you'll see tonight is a star who makes a difference for others. And Mary Lou, welcome, and I really look forward to hearing from you tonight. Thank you.
Is that right? Is that better for everyone?
Yep.
Yeah.
Because I think I might leave now. Thank you so much, John. That's a very generous introduction. And I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Kulin Nation, the traditional owners of the land we meet on today, who have been custodians of this land for many centuries. I also want to acknowledge my mum for her ongoing support. She has made the trip to Monash this evening. I also want to thank the Dean for supporting this lecture series and profiling the work of researchers in our faculty. I think it's a great opportunity and very important. So without further ado, I'm going to begin this talk, which is Progressive Sexuality Education and the Conceits of Secularism. And I'm going to begin with a bit of data, which is from Central High, which is a pseudonym for a high school in inner suburban Melbourne, in an area that has experienced high levels of gentrification. It's a school that is highly sought after, gifted and talented program, international links, Rainbow Day, lots of gay posters. It's also a school that has quite a significant amount of students who's come from families that list them as having no religion. As you can see, this is significantly above the Australian average. And the participants who were in a focus group that I'm just going to talk about were in year 9 and 10. There were 5 males and 1 female. Only one of the students in the group identified as religion, and he identified as a Buddhist. And I just want to, and I was having a talk to them about sexuality education and what happens in sexuality education. And I thought that, and I asked them about if arranged marriage could be something that could be a part of sexuality education as a discussion. And they're very articulate, these guys. One of them, Daniel from Central High says, it doesn't have much to do with sexuality, really. Yeah, I would say it's more of a humanities subject. It's someone's rights. It's for a law subject. I wouldn't say it has much to do with this because there are all sorts of things you could like. I don't think it's really that relevant, no. I think technically it could be touched on, sexual education, but as a main topic, it seems to suit better in something like humanities. So this data is drawn from an Australian Research Council project, which I did with Peter Sanjacta, Kathleen Quinlivan and Louisa Allen, on responding to cultural and religious difference in sexuality education. And I think that this quote is quite a good way to start this talk because it speaks to the ways that people carve off what's appropriate within sexuality education and what's not. So I kind of got the sense that, you know, if you're talking about something that requires your opinion, that's not part of sexuality education because sexuality education in these students' minds was about facts. It wasn't about, you know, talking about opinion. That was for humanities. And it was interesting to me that they had this strong sense in Year 8 of how knowledge was properly divided. And so this is the talk outline. Oh no, sorry, I didn't finish the quote. So why are you making that distinction, I asked? So in my view, I'm speaking for all of us here, I love that. This isn't really about sort of relationships as such. This is more about sort of cultural and theological and also sort of what decisions, what sort of your opinion matters. I think a lot more could be learnt and understood about these issues if they were addressed as a cultural issue and social issue rather than a sexual issue. So again, they're making that distinction. I'm not too sure what a sexual issue is in their mind, but this isn't it. And this is my talk outline. That's very good. And I'll see. I'm going to see how I go with time, and if I'm pressed, I might give part 4 of this. Okay, so in their book, The Politics of Virginity, Abstinence in Sex Education, Alicia Dowen and Jean Williams frame debates about sexuality education in the US as part of a broader range of morality policies where there is a juxtaposition of culturally progressive and secularist beliefs against culturally traditional and religiously fundamentalist beliefs. In this characterisation of debates over sexuality education in the US context, Dowen and Williams do not seek to unsettle this binary. They place themselves firmly on the side of those they would situate as culturally progressive and secular. This is a position I have also occupied, and one I strategically continue to adopt, although increasingly hesitantly. In order to have a legible position in debates about sexuality education, it is sometimes necessary to align oneself with one set of beliefs or the other. People may assume a queer academic that utilises queer theory, that's me, ipso facto is culturally progressive. In writing this lecture, one aim is to unsettle this framing of debates about sexuality education because of the way that it aligns religion, fundamentalism and traditionalism, as well as the alignment of progressivism with secularism. In seeking to question and destabilise these alignments, my hope is that different sorts of questions and investigations might take place. For instance, thinking about how secularism can be morally conservative and religion culturally progressive. I also want to move beyond the idea of admitting religion's progressivism, which is by no means a revelatory claim. Rather, I consider how it might be possible to enrich conceptualisations of sexuality education in research and practice via an engagement with ways of thinking about sexuality, agency, pleasure and homophobia that are overtly political, moral, religious and sometimes antagonistic. A specific focus is identifying and analysing types of thinking commonly associated with progressivist points of view in sexuality education. This undertaking will enable a better appreciation of how progressivism is constituted, as well as taking seriously critiques of sexuality education that bristle at the alleged neutrality of progressivism. So I'm trying to create a space in which the field of sexuality education might think more about diversity in terms of religiosity and secularity, alongside its current preoccupations with sexual and gender minorities, race and class. In a discussion of sexuality education policy, Chris Mayo asks, how might human rights-based sexuality education policy, for instance, balance its concern with minority practices with its respect for diverse cultures, not all of which are inclusive? The human rights framework would need to be extremely robust, and policy would need to suggest ways to create spaces for diverse practices and intergroup respect. The minority practices that Mayo refers to don't specifically incorporate religious and cultural differences, but there may be a space for the incorporation of conversations about religion and sexuality within this frame. There may also be a need to move away from rights-based frameworks, which I believe is following Judith Butler, because she points out in her article Sexual Politics, Torture and Secular Time that struggles for sexual expression depend upon the restriction and foreclosure of rights of religious expression. So if we are to stay within the liberal framework, and so we can see something of an antinomy within this discourse of liberal rights itself. So she's pointing out here that, like, when we set up, often in rights discourses, what you get up is sexual freedom versus religious freedom is this tension, and it's often an irresolvable tension. And so she's saying that we need to maybe think of different ways of resolving it outside of a rights-based discourse. Another key figure in recent discussions of secularism is Charles Taylor. In writing about Taylor's A Secular Age, Michael Warner, Jonathan Van Antwerpen, and Craig Calhoun state that this text displaces the common sense opposition between the religious and the secular, with a new understanding in which this opposition appears only as a late and retrospective misrecognition. So Taylor criticises the view that modernity inevitably marginalises religion. He focuses on how conditions of secularity have come to shape both belief and unbelief alike. So however you think about sexuality education, it's been shaped in some way by secularity. Inspired by Taylor, this lecture focuses on what such claims might mean for sex ed. What are the conditions of secularity in sexuality education, and how have they come to shape oppositional thinking between the religious and the secular? For Taylor, this type of oppositional thinking is a misrecognition which is based in what he terms subtraction stories that identify a certain essential tendency or character which holds everywhere and always of human beings. An example of this is the picture of human agents as essentially individuals operating by instrumental reason. In the subtraction story, we have just shucked off some of our false beliefs, some fears of imagined objects. In that same focus group, one of the students commented that people that believe in abstinence must be on meth. Which I think is an example of exactly this style of thought. That sense that, like, you know, if you believe in abstinence, then you're just nuts. And that's kind of what. And it's interesting, like, how young I think that those beliefs are already ingrained. So Taylor explicitly rejects subtraction theories, which associate religiosity with transcendence and irrationality and secularism with naturalism and rationality. So Taylor does not see secularity as the absence of religion from public spaces or the separation of church and state, because within this logic, people tend to see secularism and religion as somehow distinct. For Taylor, the very idea of secularity is predicated on particular understandings about belief. In undertaking his study of secularism, Taylor states his aim is to provoke conversations between a host of different positions: religious, non-religious, anti-religious, humanistic, anti-humanistic, and so on, in which we eschew mutual caricature and try to understand what fullness means for the other. So an aim of this lecture is to provoke conversations about different positions related to sexuality education from a perspective that doesn't seek to privilege a particular perspective at the outset. Which brings me to part 2. So this is called Identifying Progressive Preconceptions of Sexuality Education. Gail Rubin, in concluding her article Thinking Sex, writes that those who consider themselves progressive need to examine their preconceptions and update their sexual educations. I was lying in bed the other night and I had one of those like epiphanies that I should have had quite a long time ago about this book, which is the same name as the lecture. And the epiphany was like when I was I had a lot of trouble writing the introduction, and I was trying to find people who were in sexuality education who were saying they were progressive, and that kind of completely misses the point, because the point is that progressivism is it's a whole set of attitudes. It's not people who say they're progressive, it's all the things that they do, how they constitute themselves as progressive. But I've still gone ahead in this talk and find some people who say they're progressive as well. But some progressive preconceptions about sexuality education in public schools that I examine in this lecture include the following. That sexuality education is optimal when it is underpinned by rigorous scientific research and rational debate. The sexuality education needs to promote sexual autonomy in order to ensure that young people are able to act as autonomous sexual subjects. The sexuality education is responsible for the cultivation of tolerance of sexual and gender diversity. And sexuality education in public education precludes discussion of the intersections between faith, religion and morality, because such conversations should happen in private. So, and I'm talking here specifically about sexuality education in public schools. So I'll demonstrate how these ideas have come over time to be associated with a progressive project within sexuality education. These preconceptions are at once familiar and contradictory within the context of progressive sexuality education. The descriptor progressive is currently utilised both as a badge of pride and a term of abuse in the field. Judith Butler argues that moving forward has to be distinguished from progress. What cannot be brought forward? What is left behind? There's always something left behind, especially in aggressive notions of progress that hold out the promise of final redemption. I'm not suggesting that notions of progressivism in sex ed are aggressive in the way constituted by Butler above, but I do think that labelling something as progressive suggests that certain understandings of sexuality are left behind, and that what is being jettisoned is not always clear. In the Australian context, Tiffany Jones, an Australian researcher studying GLBTI queer and questioning students, suggests that's gay, lesbian, bisexual, trans, intersex, queer and questioning. Just in case you don't know the acronym already. And she's from the Australian Research Centre. She was when she wrote this for studies in health and sexuality. And she writes, which I think is one common understanding of progressive sexuality education, that it has messages in classrooms which address homophobia, sexual autonomy, sexual experimentation, and even heterosexuals get a look in when we do. So notions of progressivism are constituted as synonymous with comprehensive sexuality education. In the Australian context, comprehensive sexuality education is widely adopted in the public schools, though public school students also receive different variations of what has come to be known as abstinence-based sexuality education, because public schools in Australia routinely use a range of providers in the provision of sexuality education. So Domin and Williams identify three primary types of sexuality in the US context, and this is also, I think, the case in Australia. So you can see you've got the comprehensive approach, the abstinence-based approach, and abstinence only. And all of them teach abstinence, but abstinence only is a very specific sort of curriculum which is teaches teens that all premarital sexual activity for both teens and adults is unhealthy physically and psychologically. Okay. So in Australia and the US, progressive sexuality education has come to be associated with this comprehensive approach. One implication of this is that people who critique comprehensive sex ed can be constituted as anti-progressive and backward. Progressive sexuality education is constituted as something that any reasonable person who is interested in the sexual health of young people should get behind, because it is critical to society, imperative for public health, and reality-based. The tone of such expression is significant because of the certainty that they convey. This tone sometimes suggests progressive sexuality may be contentious, but it's also rendered as indispensable. Heather Boonstra, a senior public policy associate of the Guttmacher Institute, and having a bit of a segue to the US here. And the Guttmacher Institute is like one of the key US bodies that advocates for comprehensive sexuality education. And she wrote a piece entitled, helpfully for this talk, Progressive and Pragmatic, the National Sexuality Education Standards for US public schools, and this was published in 2012. And this title denotes these standards as aligned with the progressive agenda, but the word progressive does not appear anywhere else in the document. At first glance, this might seem unremarkable. Boonstra, an influential lobbyist in debates about sex ed in the US, does not see the need to define what progressive means in this context. The absence of a definition or elaboration of progressive suggests that Boonstra is speaking to the converted. Readers don't need a definition of progressive because anybody who knows the authors of the standards will be aware of their stance on sexuality education. So Boonstra collectively understands these organisations as responsible for the production of standards that underpin a progressive sexuality education. It appears that there is some agreement about what constitutes a progressive sexuality education, but how did this consensus come about? I argue that the development of this consensus about what constitutes progressive in this context requires much more excavation and interrogation. There also needs to be some clarity about what is left behind in the elaboration of standards associated with a progressive sexuality education. So, the Reverend Deborah Hafner, who was a former CEO of SEEKers, which is another peak body that supports comprehensive sexuality education in the US, is now the director of the Religious Institute on Sexual Morality, Justice and Healing. And she is cited by Boonstra in the aforementioned article, Progressive and Pragmatic. In this piece, the Reverend Hafner objects to the standards outlined by Boonstra because she believes that they will not fulfil young people's need for information and education about sexuality issues, nor do they adequately provide a values-based framework for young people's decision-making. Boonstra deems Hafner's critique as worthy of inclusion in her discussion of the national standards for sexuality education, but the implication of this critique for the production of a progressive and pragmatic approach is not spelled out. Hafner's objection suggests that the question of how values and religion influence sex ed may be one of the things that is left behind in Boonstra's conceptualisation of progressive sex ed. Elsewhere, Boonstra has been explicitly supportive of the role of faith-based organisations in advocacy for comprehensive sexuality education, arguing that people of faith support comprehensive sex ed for religious reasons, and this has a way of moving the political debate over sex education and ultimately affecting policies that impact young people now and in their future. However, there's no mention of this advocacy of the involvement of faith-based organisations in comprehensive sex ed in the national standards. So for Hafner, sex ed is intrinsically related to religion and is the inspiration for her work in the promotion of sex ed that could be constituted by many as progressive. So Hafner's theological commitment to comprehensive sexuality education is accompanied by an expressed desire for a values-based framework for sexuality education. But unlike Hafner, I have no theological commitments in relation to sex ed provision, but I have come to question progressive sex ed standards that do not explicitly engage with questions of faith and their relationship to values. My preoccupation with this separation is more epistemological than theological. What are the grounds for this separation? Are there ways in which religion and values can be usefully incorporated in progressive sexuality education? Should we just lose that term altogether? And should such topics be left behind? That's a repeat. Okay, the next section, part 3. So this is called diagnosing leftist disease with religion in sexuality education in public schools. In the production of her book, The Politics of Piety, the Islamic Revival of the Feminist Subject, Sabah Mahmood writes that I have come to believe that a certain amount of self-scrutiny and scepticism is essential regarding the certainty of my own political commitments when trying to understand the lives of others who do not necessarily share these commitments. Mahmood goes on to attempt to diagnose the disease of progressive leftists associated with feminism, including herself, and I would include myself here, in grappling with expressions of religious conservatism. In part, she attributes this disease to progressive associations of these movements with the appearance of religion outside the private space of individualised belief. For those with well-honed secular, liberal and progressive sensibilities, the slightest eruption of religion into the public domain is frequently experienced as a dangerous affront, one that threatens to subject us to normative morality dictated by mullahs and priests. This fear is accompanied by a deep self-assurance about the truth of the progressive secular imaginary. One assumes that the life forms it offers are the best way out for those unenlightened souls, mired as they are in spectral hopes that gods and prophets hold out to them. This disease, with the shift of religion into the public sphere, as well as the self-assurance associated with the embrace of the progressive secular imaginary, are also present in the production of progressive sexuality education. This isn't to say that there are not good reasons for critiquing some religious approaches to sexuality education, but in making such critiques, it is also important to be mindful of the normative moralities that underpin progressive secular imaginaries of sexuality education. Anne Pellegrini, writing in the US context post-1979, the year she points out of the Iranian Revolution and the emergence of Jerry Falwell's moral majority. Thank you. Draws attention to some of these normative alignments. She highlights, so she thinks about the alignment of the queer with the secular and of sexual conservatism with the religious. These alignments, she says, have emerged in response to cultural wars and battles over sex, battles which have not been nearly so vociferous in the Australian context, but we can see them, I think, becoming more lively in Victoria at the moment. Yet the alignments that Pellegrini describes of the queer with the secular and of sexual conservatism with the religious are manifest here. And in contemplating these alignments, Pellegrini turns her attention to the political and epistemological stakes of the secular academy's disidentification, not just with religion, but with feelings coded as religious. This is of concern to her because she believes that this queer secularism may actually reinforce the claims of the right to a monopoly on religion. It struck me while I've been working on this project how often colleagues are willing to completely diss religion in ways that they would never do about race and about gender. But it's really fine to put the boot into religion. And it's interesting to me what that means about how people feel about things in different contexts. A few times I've had lunch and I've mentioned what this project's about, and people have just gone off. And it's interesting to me how that I think is legislated. It's okay to really stick the boot in this context, but in other contexts it's seen as not okay. One example of how this monopoly is evidenced in sexuality education is present in an opinion piece in the Washington Times entitled "Parental Outrage Can Protect Our Kids from Progressive Sex Ed." In this piece, Mary Beth Hicks constitutes progressive sexuality education as synonymous with comprehensive sexuality education, and she constructs this approach to sex education as deliberately exploiting children. So Hicks constitutes a progressive approach as exploitative. And it's easy to dismiss such perspectives as hyperbolic, but they do have political power, and they operate to reinforce the comprehensive approach as an amoral zone. Hicks isn't alone in this view. In 2000, 2011, Pope Benedict XVI, in an address to foreign diplomats at the Vatican, stated that countries which mandated obligatory participation in sex ed courses attack religious freedom because they convey a neutral concept of the person and of life, yet in fact reflect an anthropology opposed to faith. I agree with Pope Benedict, and I don't say that very often, but I don't think that sexuality education is neutral. But through the absence of religious discourse, sexuality education may be perceived as opposed to faith. Following on from the constitution of comprehensive sexuality education as progressive, this effectively plays into the hands of religious conservatives such as Hicks, who seeks to constitute this approach as progressive and therefore entirely devoid of religion and therefore exploitative. To be clear, my aim here is not to convince Hicks or the Catholic Church to embrace my vision of comprehensive sexuality education. I am not so naive to believe that adding religion to a comprehensive approach will mollify critics such as Hicks or Pope Benedict. But I do think that Hafner's critique is one that should be attended to by researchers and advocates of comprehensive sexuality education. Why does Hafner see the sexuality education standards espoused by Boonstra as lacking? Is this a fair critique? If so, what are the implications? Should it alter the way that comprehensive sexuality education is envisaged? I also want to engage other researchers, educators and workers in health and health promotion who might convey a neutral concept of the person and of life in the way that they engage in sexuality education. How might losing the progressive tag and thinking differently about the relationship between faith and comprehensive sexuality education help us in reimagining sexuality education? A specific focus of this lecture is debates about sex ed located in public schools, though the arguments expressed here clearly have implications for sex ed more broadly. Wherever and whenever sex ed is funded by government or non-government organisations as part of health promotion projects, the question of how publicly funded or secular organisations engage with people of diverse sexualities, ethnicities and religious affiliations needs to be engaged. Marian Maddox, in her text Taking God to School, argues the importance of having conversations about the place of religion in public schools. In this lecture, I want to argue the importance of having conversations about the place of religion and culture in sex ed in public schools. I propose that discussions of religion, spirituality, morals, ethics and belief all have a place in sexuality education. And to my mind, these things are as central to sex ed as information about how to have safer sex and negotiate consent. In writing this lecture, I also have a strategic aim, which is not to see debates about the place of religion in sex ed to those on the left and the right who would seek to align religion with sexual conservatism. I also think that people like myself who are not religious but are concerned with the production of a sexuality education that has wide reach and relevance need to be articulate in their response to religious objections and to the inclusion of religious perspectives. I believe advocacy for comprehensive sexuality education could be strengthened in Australia and overseas if advocates of this approach are better able to illustrate how it thoughtfully engages with questions of cultural and religious difference. And I think I've got time for this last section, which isn't very long. Okay, so this is called What's a Queer Theorist Like You Doing in a Place Like This? A brief biography of the research question. This is where you come in, Mum. I am writing this lecture from the perspective of somebody who is now non-religious. I hope that's not news to you. But who grew up in a Catholic family. While I have been working on this text, several people have inquired about my motivation in undertaking such a project. Maybe wrongly, I sometimes assume a subtext behind this inquiry, although I also admit that it is likely my own paranoid reading. Something along the lines of, what's a queer theorist like you doing in a place like this? And believe me, I've asked myself that question many times over the last 5 years. Professor Bill Piner was, I think, the first colleague to put this question to me while I had the good fortune to be a visiting scholar at UBC in Canada. I think Piner wanted to know the biography of my research question. what baggage I bring along to this investigation. While my own experiences of religion and sexuality education cannot be neatly mapped to this project, I think that some parts of my biography are relevant insofar as they have shaped my desire to create a space for more variety in conversations about the place of sex ed in public schools. Like many Australians, my own schooling took place exclusively in Catholic schools, though these Catholic schools were by no means exclusive in terms of the religiosity of teachers and students. My primary school was co-educational, St Bede's, but my secondary school was single-sex. And as my mother put it when I recently inquired as to how I ended up at my secondary school, Siena Ladies College, or Siena Ladies Convent School, as my brothers always insisted to my chagrin, she said that in the 1970s and 80s, Catholics just put their children in Catholic schools. Obvious. Her decision to do this was as unremarkable as our neighbours' decision to send their children to the local public school. My three oldest brothers engaged in Catholic schooling and then moved to the local public high school, while Damien, the brother closest in age to me, took the opposite path, transferring from a local high to a Catholic boys' school. While we went to Mass on Sunday, my parents were not religious about crossing boundaries in terms of school choice. Like other Australian parents who are in a position to choose where their children will be educated, my parents' consumption of education was guided by what they thought was best for their children, by their own experiences of religious education, and by their affinities with the local Catholic community. This notion of choice in education provision has proliferated in Australia since the 70s. Successive federal governments have widened provision of public funding to private and religious schools. Dominican nuns oversaw my secondary education. Some were, in my memory, feminists who were strong on liberation theology. Social justice was big on their religious education agenda, and this was manifest in the service element of our curriculum. Though on reflection, the types of service in which we engaged were principally of the variety that engaged those seen to be less fortunate. I also remember that these same nuns hired ex-priests, now married, and gay men as teachers. Quite camp gay men. My experience of Catholic schooling was also characterised by homophobia, though I am sure public school students have also hurled homophobic taunts. And a sexuality education that highlighted marriage, the rhythm method, and gave no hint of other forms of sexual relationships. While lesbianism was officially absent in the curriculum, it was a constant presence in the taunts of peers in the playground and locker room, taunts in which I readily produced, safe in the knowledge of my own straight credentials, at least at that time. In presenting on this research in preparation for a book related to the lecture, I've also received comments from peers regarding suggesting that it gives solace to the continuation of religious involvement in public education. I do believe that public schools and public funding of education should be able to create a space for discussions of religion. This research has also been seen as complicit in the sustenance of a religious education system that has condoned the sexual abuse of countless children through covering up the sexual crimes of clergy. I don't see my role here as defender of the Catholic Church, but one of my aims is not to replace muscular Christianity with an even more muscular formation of secularity. Inspired by Jacobson and Pellegrini, I'm also interested in how and where spaces might be made for secular and religious feelings and knowings to touch. At the age of 15, my older brother Damien was killed in a car accident on New Year's Eve. Inevitably, this event shook things up at home. I misremember it as a catalyst for my father's evangelical turn, to which I was briefly hailed, but I promptly rejected these overtures. The laying on of hands at the Catholic Evangelical Youth Group associated with the religious meetings that attended was definitely not my cup of tea. But Dad continues to be a daily churchgoer, still believing in the infallibility of the Lord. I think my mother rejected this route because she's quite quick to critique the Catholic Church, but she continues her alliance. Nor are my siblings churchgoers. For me, coming out post-university, both parents have been incredibly supportive. That is accepting of my partner, my friends and me, while likely continuing to pray that I might be liberated from my sexual transgressions. Maybe in part because of this quietly agonistic relationship with Dad, I do believe that sexuality education in public schools needs to attend more thoughtfully to religious and cultural differences. I believe that sexuality education practice and research that circulates within the public square will be strengthened if it can better engage differences related to sexuality, culture, race and religion. So this lecture has been an attempt to grasp and critically interrogate contemporary habits of thought I see as conditioned by progressive secular imaginaries in sexuality education. And just to finish, I want to go to the boys and the girl at Central High one more time. And so this is what they said at the end of the focus group, probably to mollify me, I'm aware. But we did stop talking about the topic, but it was in their minds clearly because they came back to it when I asked for some closing comments about what they'd like to see happen in sexuality education. And Dirk says, I would be very happy, I would quite like to do more cultural stuff. I was saying before that this forced marriage wouldn't fit into what we do at the moment at all, because it's a completely different train of thinking. But if they're rewriting the curriculum, I think we should definitely have some more in-depth cultural analysis of issues. Yes, cultural issues, says Daniel. And Arthur says, and just rather than learning that this is okay and this is bad, just have more discussion and have a look at it from those perspectives. Yeah, how sex is different from different cultures and different people. And that's it.
So we've got ample time for questions. I think what Mary Lou has done tonight, is what we would expect of a professorial presentation. Push the boundaries, cause us to think, make us look differently at what we perhaps take for granted. I'm not a Catholic boy, but it is interesting. I taught in Catholic schools, and it does challenge some of the conceptions that you bring with you and take away from the situation. It is interesting. So questions for Mary Lou, please. Yes, David, thank you.
I said I'd spare you. Just a quick comment and then I want a response to a question. I think you've set up secular as a straw person that can easily be blown down because you've not actually defined, and this is what I'm asking you, what is actually secular? Because secular has become a pejorative term amongst people of religion, but I don't believe that it is. So how are you using the term secular tonight?
There's so much written about what secular means. I think that secular is, it's kind of a bit like asking how you define postmodernism. It depends on who you read and how they think about it. And the people that I've been thinking with tonight are Charles Taylor, Saba Mahmood, and Talal Assad, who are all writers that are thinking about secularism as something which has shaped the way that we think over centuries. That is something that has certain sorts of assumptions, cultural practices, political practices, theories about epistemology associated with it, and that these things are often, Assad says that secularism often inhabits the shadows. So it's there, I think, forming our beliefs in all sorts of ways that might not immediately seem secular. And I think that that's true of people who are religious and people who are secular. So in the Australian context, when we think about, schooling as secular, for instance, what does that mean given we're a Christian nation? How,
But we're not a Christian nation.
Well, I think historically...
We never were. And
I think that's an argument that you could have about the historical traditions and political traditions within Australia. When I go into a lot of schools that are putatively public schools, you do see stuff happens in them that there's definitely from a Christian tradition more than you would see stuff that happens, I think, from other religious traditions. I'm not saying that, I'm not advocating that we see one Christian line that's true and pure. I'm just saying that the Christian influence in white Australian history is very profound, and that I think has a huge influence in how we resist it, and also how it influences what we do.
Yeah.
Yes, please.
In the beginning, when you asked when you asked your students, oh, why can't arranged marriage be considered as a part of sexual education? And from what I am understanding is that there is more, it seems to me at least that you are advocating more of a blurring of the lines between you must teach this and you must teach this as a part of this discipline and that discipline and so on and so forth. If I could get your response and your comment to that, how is it that for the people in the audience that are teachers, how is it that we can begin to blend those things so that regardless of what school we're teaching in, we can give well-rounded views and well-rounded discussion?
Well, I think that like there's all sorts of issues in which sexuality education like touches on these things, but maybe doesn't go into them in a lot of depth. Like one thing that I've been thinking about is homophobia. So I think homophobia is something which is on the agenda in sexuality education. It's supported by the Victorian state government. And I think that and one way of thinking about homophobia is to talk about homophobia as something which is wrong, and that good people aren't homophobic. And I think that is a fine line, but I also think it's kind of a bit like saying no to racism, in the sense that and I think I'm being quite deliberately provocative here, but I think that in doing that, it's not very educative, because it doesn't actually help people to think about why somebody might have a different view about homosexuality to the person sitting next to them. And so I'd like to see conversations about sexuality that enable and admit conversations that are informed by cultural and religious belief in the context of sexuality education. I'm not saying here it's okay to call somebody a fag in the hallway or the playground. I'm definitely not saying that's okay, but I do think that in order to understand how different people think about something like homophobia, that just saying no to it doesn't really get at the way that different people might think about it.
So you want the logic behind the comment. Is that what you're trying to say?
I'd like to find out how people know what they know about sexuality to be part of what happens in sexuality education. So they're not just told, this is, these boys had learned how to put, a condom on a banana, which is, a very favourite, and that was their favourite lesson. And they'd also learned several times in a row about STIs. But they hadn't had any conversations about sexuality much at all. And there was a few conversations about consent, but consent's another thing which is really, I think, different in different cultural and religious contexts. So how can, bringing culture and religion into that space develop a more interesting, I think, conversation about consent?
Do you think that sex education is too focused on particulars like biomechanism and not about, let's say, social interactions like dating, flirting, and I guess the stuff that we do 90% of the time, and not that little 1 or 10%. Yeah.
And there's kind of like a long tradition in sexuality education research that makes just that argument. But kind of like the argument that it makes is, I think, is a secular argument in relationship to that, is that really what we need is less facts and figures and more pleasure and desire. And that argument began, I think it was in 1988 with Michelle Fine. So I've been having that discussion for quite a long time, but I've also kind of written about how I think notions of pleasure and desire in sexuality education are also quite secular. Because they kind of I think tend to argue that, pleasure just is intrinsically good in sexuality education. We all kind of agree on how we think about pleasure in sexuality education and it's much better to talk about pleasure than to talk about danger. But I think that, again, what we see as pleasurable is very, I think, contingent upon, some of our own histories, our own cultures, how can that inform what we imagine pleasure, danger, desire to be? But I don't see that happening very soon.
Question here? Yes, please.
Okay, sorry. I've actually got two questions, but I know it's not allowed, but
You can do
the first
two
one
questions.
makes me fun. Mary Lou, you mentioned sexuality education a lot, but I'm assuming most schools just refer to it as sex ed. Is there anywhere that actually refers to it as sexuality education?
I think in the national curriculum now it's referred to as sexuality education. Sex and relationships education.
Okay.
So it has that broader frame.
Thank you, Joe. And the main question is, now I'm assuming I sort of already know the answer to this, but you are talking about bringing religion and discussions of religion into the classroom, into the sex ed and schooling. I'm assuming though you're not talking about kind of a secular perspective on religion, which brings into all sorts of religions from a secular perspective, looking at Buddhism and, you know, different sorts of approaches, but you're thinking about something else rather than
within the confines of like I think that sexuality education is something that definitely can happen not just in health and PE. I think it can happen in English. I think it can happen in media studies. I think, you know, it can happen across the curriculum very easily. But I think that it is something which I think that like I mean. I have this, one of my fantasies, which hasn't come to bear yet, is a sex museum in the shape of ovaries. And it's going to be on a peninsula in Geelong. It's going to be this massive public pedagogical space around sex. And it's going to have, like, you know, people who are sexperts, it's going to have religious figures, it's going to have all sorts of people in it who are having conversations about sex. That's kind of like, you know, my sex education fantasy. That, you know, different sorts of people are in that space, and secular people aren't interpreting religion for religious types, and religious types aren't having, and vice versa. Yeah?
You heard it first here.
Mary Lou, your talk has been so wonderfully provocative and interesting. I really enjoyed it very, very much. And for me, it kind of touches on, in my area in social ed, in that, although, you know, some of this, we just had a dust up a week and a half ago, and with some of my students in one of the schools that, you know, dared to bring up sexual identity issues, and the principal was like, we don't do that here, and there was phone calls and whatnot. And so when the students said, well, we can talk about racism, and the principal was like, okay, that's better. So, but in social education, not only do those identity, gender, and sexual identity is appropriate, but also comparative religion, or talking about religion, is, you know, and as a devout but non-proselytizing atheist, I think that that talking about religion is exciting and interesting, and history and religion and how it flows together. So I guess more of a comment. It just seems that would be rich and interesting in sexuality education, but just in general. But it seems one of those topics, the religious aspect of it, that folks are just so gun shy around. But it's part of so many people's lives and identities.
So there's also this really great scholar called Amy Hollywood. She's got the best name.
Amy, that's a great name.
and she is a feminist theologian at Harvard, and she's written about, she really hates comparative religion courses, because she thinks that they are sort of like, I think what Peter was referring to as, it's kind of like, you know, religion light. Because like it is like, you know, like it's the respectable rational face of religion, as opposed to, like, you know, dogma, and that people are just afraid of dogma. And then that's kind of what Saba Mahmood's arguing as well in her book, like about the politics of piety, that there's certain sorts of religion, like, and Talal Assad says the same, that when religion agrees with secularism, we think it's great. When it disagrees with secularism, we hate it. And I think that is kind of like, I think that comparative religion is a bit like that.
Deb?
Yeah, this is just a fun fact that I thought I'd share with you that has just re-emerged in my brain. As a devout atheist, I did end up sending my daughter here to a Hasidic Jewish secondary school.
She loves it.
She did, she loved it. And she's also, I don't know what she is, she's not religious, but, you know, she's Jewish or half Jewish, so anyway, she went. And both out of her mouth and the mouth of the rabbi who taught many of the religious courses, which she didn't have to attend, I think some of the best discussions about sex and sexuality happened in what I would call extremely religious, like crazy religious, sorry to use the word, very ultra conservative. In these classes, the rabbi also said, what a breath of fresh air. Everyone always says the same thing. Your daughter has a completely different perspective, and we can finally have a conversation. And yeah, I was just absolutely floored when both she and he at different times brought up to me just how great the conversations were. And she was surprised. Oh God, everyone differs in opinion, but it was really, really good to be able to talk about it. And she didn't have those conversations in her secular school, and I just thought it was quite astounding. I thought I'd share that with you.
Dina.
Sorry.
No, go ahead, Jen.
Go ahead. I do know this lady has been trying to ask questions for the
I
last.
know, I didn't want to embarrass you.
Sorry. I know you want to quite answer.
Okay, thank you. So I was wondering if you include too much of religion and culture into the sex education, do you think it will draw away from what the primary purpose of sex education is, and it will almost like inflict students with emotion, whether the scientific aspects of sex education, which are almost undebatable? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, like I think I know what you mean. Like I think that there's a sense that we've got, it's interesting. Like at Central High, I went there for 2 years to observe their sex education lessons. They only happened in one. Like they were just cut off for second year. And that's, I think, happens a lot in sexuality education. Like I still got to talk to the students, but they didn't have the lessons. Like, and I think often like sex ed is such a minority part of the curriculum in teacher education and in school education, that I think that it is, like, it's very hard to get anything across to them. But I think that what tends to happen now is that they just get the same thing in years 5, 6, 7, 8, and there's not really anything else that happens.
I'll work my way around.
You just mentioned it. Your thoughts on pre-service teacher education, when you think about the sophisticated kinds of understandings that one might need as a teacher. Just wondering, when you said it shouldn't be done in health and physical education, just wondering what your thoughts are.
I don't know if I said it shouldn't be done. I think that that's your fantasy.
Oh, predicting.
But
Not only, sorry.
I think that it should be done across the curriculum, definitely. And I do think that it's like, I think that like students that I teach really like learning about sexuality education. There's quite a few of them here tonight. and I think that there's a sense that like they want more of that content, but it is very hard to find places for it in, teacher education, like sex education is crowded, I know, but like I think that we need a greater profile for health and wellbeing stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll work my way around.
I believe you.
Yeah, I'll get there.
So I just have a question about spirituality. Where does that fit in a non-sort of secular spirituality?
Well, I think that, if there's people in the classroom who want to bring that in, they should be able to talk about it. I think that, we shouldn't just say that, I'm just saying it shouldn't just be about the facts, and it shouldn't just be, and that things that like emotions and beliefs that inform it should be a part of the conversation.
The back of the room will come down the front.
Just to add on to the previous question, on one hand, let's say if you are a religious person, you'd probably attend a 1 or 2 hour discourse or whatever about values, about living as a better human being, or about the values of the Bible or the scripture, whatever it is, the dogma and beliefs. But in secular society, the main form of value giving is supposedly through parents. And in our education system, we tend to focus on metrics that we can test, verify, gauge the students on their performance of whatever their capability is. But there is none of that human values, soft fuzzy, abstract things. Is that a flaw in our education system?
I don't think it's true to say that it's not there at all. I do think that it depends on the teachers. I think, sometimes I think it is there. And I do think that it could be a much richer part. And I think that, I know that there's a move afoot in Victoria and nationally to try and get education about religions onto the curriculum. And I think that discussions about ethics as part of the curriculum would be great as well. They would do, I think, some of that work for students. And I'd like to see it about religion and ethics.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it too. In fact, the conversations afterwards have been really helpful too, to pull out different things. And I've just been thinking, right when you started talking, you were talking about culture and religion and sort of talking about them almost as if they were the same thing, or using the words interchangeably. And I'm just intrigued on your perspective of whether, but then you started talking about secularity, identity, sort of individual, whatever students in a classroom might come up with, it's all relevant. So I'm wondering whether you see them as being different things, or whether they are all about where the students are coming from, or...
Well, I think that, one of the things that I think has been interesting in the research that we did on cultural and religious difference is that the way different students that we spoke to, for instance, who were Muslim, talked about students at their school who were gay. And there was clearly no agreement among the Muslim students, which shouldn't be surprising, about what it meant to be, about their gay peers. But I think it would be really great if they could be in a classroom hearing that and having conversations that, show the different ways that, that their different families mediated with their different cultural backgrounds and their religious teaching in really different ways of thinking about, what it means to be gay. And that, I think, would be, with the caveat that, it's okay to say, at my house, which was certainly true for me growing up, being gay wasn't okay. And but if I could never express that, then, how can I learn and hear about what other people think?
I can't help thinking about from a specific perspective where a lot of so-called cultural beliefs have been overwhelmed by religious, people coming in and highlighting a particular religious perspective. So the cultural perspective is sort of a bit topsy-turvy, and it gets confusing as to what we need to believe and what is part of our family or what's part of our community.
Well, one of the people on the project is a Maori guy, Clive Aspen, and he talked about how when we went to New Zealand, there were lots of, we actually spoke to Pacifica people who were delivering sexuality education from a religious perspective. And they, it was interesting, I think, he was a gay Maori who was really pissed off with what the Pacifica people were doing because they were Christian. And he just said, they've got it wrong, the pure history of Maori teaching around these issues is, not Christian. But I thought that argument for me didn't really make sense, because these people were living as Pacifica in New Zealand, and they thought that Christianity was part of who they were. But he was kind of saying, no, you're wrong. You're kind of just deluded because by missionaries. So, I think it's an interesting space to be in, how you bring those conversations together. But another thing about doing this research, for me, that's been incredibly enriching, is who I get to have conversations with. It's certainly not other queer people often. It's, it's actually, got me into all sorts of different spaces for conversations, which I've loved. And, I've had people from different refugee groups and different religious groups and different schools all coming and wanting to talk to me about the work, which has been, that was exactly the point of it, really, to be talking to people who aren't, don't really think like me around this stuff.
Thanks, Annabelle. I think we'll call it to an end there. Just a couple of things just in closing. That term that Mary Lou just used in the middle of that, pissed off, that's a technical term. Not particularly happy at the time, I think that's how that one goes. The other thing that's really important about what Mary Lou's done tonight, continually she's saying, and research, and research, and research. And this is what someone like Mary Lou brings to bear on our work. This is not about opinion. This is about understanding situations and understanding them in ways that are based on serious examination of situations. And Mary Lou, you've had some wonderful questions tonight, you've had great discussion, you've drawn people in, and I think it would be wonderful if that's able to continue as we leave here. You don't have to disappear. Please remember to put your glasses back on the table so you don't have a problem. That would be wonderful for me. Mary Lou, thank you very much.